Good evening. Thank you for joining me. The story I want to tell you tonight actually begins with the sound. But it is not the sound of an explosion, nor is it the sound of a siren or the murmur of a crowd. The catastrophe I will describe tonight begins with one of the most terrifying, most profound silences modern history has ever witnessed. I want to take you into a room. I ask you to visualize it. You are in Moscow. You are behind the thick walls of the Kremlin Palace, completely isolated from the outside world. Outside there is war. Outside there is winter. But inside the air is heavy, stagnant, and tense. Imagine a long, polished, enormous table, one of those famous tables. Vladimir Putin is sitting at one end of the table. But this time, there are no generals opposite him. There are none of those uniformed men we are used to seeing arriving with fake victory maps, saying, "Everything is going great, sir." There are other people at the table. Russia's money wizards are there. Sberbank CEO Herman Gref and Central Bank Governor Elvira Nabiullina. I want you to remember these names because these two people, according to what we learned from intelligence reports leaked to Western media, even The Guardian were there that day, playing the biggest gamble of their lives. What does a technocrat sitting across from a dictator normally do? They lie. They package the lie the leader wants to hear in the most beautiful way and present it. They say sanctions are making us stronger. They say the West needs us. That's what they've been telling the public on television for years. But that day, what broke the silence at that table was a confession. Herman Gref, without averting his eyes, perhaps trying to suppress the tremor in his voice, uttered the sentence, "The Russian economy is overheating. The engine is about to explode. Our resources are running out." And then Nabiullina, the tough-nut central bank chairwoman, whose intelligence even the West respects, added, "We are losing control. The brakes are no longer working." Let's pause. Let's pause for a second and feel the weight of that sentence. The brakes are no longer working. This is not a simple presentation to a head of state. This is a declaration of bankruptcy, the moment when the knife hits the bone, the moment when Putin's sanctions don't work on us fortress, built over years, was demolished from within by its very architects. So what did Putin do? Did he yell? Did he pound the table? No. According to reports, he just sank into a deep silence, because he knew too. Unlike the colorful, embellished maps the generals brought back from the front, the figures these two magicians placed on the table were the stark reality. But the real question is, why now? Why not in 2022? Why not at the start of the war? But now, did these people risk their lives and careers to say, the emperor has no clothes? This is where the hook of tonight's story lies, hidden in a news report from the world outside that table, from across the ocean. To understand this, we need to leave that stifling room in Moscow and go out onto the street. But what we see when we step outside is not the usual war scene. I want you to imagine a bank branch. Its logo is familiar, a blue arc, Citibank, the American financial giant, the symbol of global banking. For most of us, Citibank may be nothing more than a credit card statement or an ATM. But for Russia, that bank branch was much more than a building. It was Russia's last window to civilization. It was the last door open for Russian companies to receive payments from the outside world, for a factory to order spare parts from Germany, or even to find a simple international loan. All other banks had left. The SWIFT system had been shut down. Between Russia and the world, there remained a thin lifeline flowing through Citibank. And then the news came. Citibank announced that it was completely, unconditionally, and irreversibly halting its operations in Russia. Please don't dismiss this event by saying, "So what? Another bank has left." That attitude would be to miss the impending disaster. This was not a shop closing its shutters. This was pulling the plug on a patient's life support. That thin thread was severed. That last door slammed shut in their faces, never to open again. So what happened when the door closed? Chaos? But not the chaos you might imagine. Think of the streets. People are rushing to the banks. But this isn't the panic of the 1929 Great Depression, where people are thinking, "I'll save my money, I'll put it under my pillow." This was a much angrier, much more nihilistic scramble. The Russian people trampled each other in bank queues. Their goal wasn't to secure their money. Their goal was to withdraw cash and blow up the system, to blow up Putin's economy, because trust was gone. People felt that even those money magicians had lost control. Interest in long-term accounts completely vanished. No one wanted to entrust their money to the bank, even for a month. Everyone, absolutely everyone, wanted to grab as much paper money as they could get their hands on and run that day at that hour. According to statistics, only 7 out of every 100 Russians were willing to take the risk of entrusting their money to the state. The remaining 93? For them, those bank buildings were now graveyards. This is the story of a country's middle class whose savings set aside for their children's future suddenly turned into worthless pieces of paper with pictures on them. This is not an economy slowing down. This is a collapse, as the numbers show. With Citibank's exit, 98% of Russia's credit portfolio evaporated. Deposits, the money people thought was safe, have shrunk by a factor of 150 since the occupation began. 150 times. Put that on a scale in your mind. On one side is your life savings, on the other is a huge nothing. This was the panic that made Herman Greff sweat at that table and Nabiulina say, "The brakes aren't working." Because they knew currency isn't just paper. Currency is a belief system. And that belief died on Moscow's cold sidewalks when Citibank closed its last door and left. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, the scary part is just beginning. Because where money ends, the nature of the state changes. And the solution Putin found to stop the bleeding was not a reform written in any economics textbook. He resorted to a much darker, much more mafia-like method. And this method transformed Russia into the closed-off, self-devouring North Korea model we know today. So what is this method? And how did this method turn an ordinary Russian worker into a statistical hostage? In a moment, we will enter those dark factories. You know, sometimes a country's fate is determined not by the decisions that are made, but by the decisions that are not made. But here the situation is different. Here, to be active, conscious, and honest, there is a chilling choice. I just told you that Citibank closed its last door. So what did Vladimir Putin do to stop this massive bleeding? What would a normal head of state do? He would announce an emergency economic reform package. He would seek ground for peace talks. He would cut spending. Putin did none of these things, and he resorted to a classic mafia boss tactic. I'm not exaggerating when I say this. I'm talking about a literal hostage-taking operation. As Citibank tried to leave the country, the Kremlin put a threat on the table. If you don't transfer your assets to loyal oligarchs of our choosing, you won't get an exit visa. In other words, leave your assets behind, or you'll never get out of here. The result? The bank's assets were forcibly transferred behind closed doors to names loyal to the regime, such as billionaire Mikhail Prokhorov, and to institutions like Renaissance Capital. This moment marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the Russian economy. From that moment on, Russia ceased to be a rule-based, transparent, and accountable economy. Russia is now a black box, just like North Korea. Who gets what inside? How much money is transferred to whom? Which oligarch swallows which factory? It's all shrouded in darkness. And the harsh truth that Herman Greff tried to convey to Putin at that meeting, but which Putin did not want to hear, was this. When fresh blood, i.e. foreign currency and investment, does not come from outside, a system with its doors locked can only do one thing to survive: eat itself. And now I want to take you to the most painful, most human dimension of this self-cannibalism process. Welcome to the age of industrial cannibalism. When an economy collapses, the process is clear. First, the banks scream. We've heard that. Then the factories fall silent. Finally, the streets catch fire. Right now, we're in that factories fall silent phase. But this silence is very strange, very deceptive. You turn on the TV, let's say you're in a hotel room in Moscow, and Putin's propaganda machine is blaring in the news bulletins. Unemployment is at a record low. Everyone is working. Our factories are running smoothly. On paper, yes, they're right. You look at the statistics, and unemployment is negligible. But this is one of the most dangerous, most unethical lies modern history has seen. Why? Because people in Russia are no longer counted as unemployed. The system forcibly makes them hidden unemployed. It turns them into statistical hostages. Let me explain how the system works. Picture a factory in your mind. For example, a metalworking workshop. They can't get credit because Citibank left. They can't get raw materials. They're out of money. In a normal economy, what would the boss do? He would stop production, lay off the workers, and lock the doors. But not in Russia. Putin gave governors and bosses a clear order. You will not fire anyone. You will not distort the statistics. You will not cause panic among the people. That's why the bosses aren't firing those workers. They are sending them on unpaid leave. Or they are only working them 1 day a week and paying them 20% of their salary. On paper, is this man working? Yes. Does he appear employed in government records? Yes. So does this man have money in his pocket? No. Is his insurance being paid? Number. Is there food on his table? No. This man is no longer a worker. He is a ghost. And this situation I'm telling you about is not Western propaganda or a conspiracy theory. I wish it were. This is an admission from data leaked or allowed to leak by Russia's own Ministry of Labor. I don't want to overwhelm you with numbers, but keep this one in mind. 254,000. According to official records, exactly 254,000 Russian citizens are currently in the clutches of this ghost regime. That's a 2.5-fold increase over last year. And do you know what the most tragicomic part is? In August, even Vladimir Putin, famous for painting everything in rosy colors, let the truth slip out in a moment of carelessness, or perhaps a slip of the tongue, in front of the cameras. Yes, he said, there are problems in some sectors, and about 200,000 people are at risk. When a leader says 200,000 people are at risk during wartime, you should add at least one more zero to that number, because this figure of 254,000 only includes officially registered workers. What about the millions of undocumented Central Asian migrants? What about those in the service sector? They aren't even included in this count. The real number is in the millions. Let's pause here for a moment. Doesn't this sound familiar to you? I want to mention a historical echo. This situation reminds me of the last dying years of the Soviet Union. There's that famous joke. We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. In the Soviet Union, the shelves were empty, but the factories appeared to be working. But even then, there was at least a social contract. The state met the most basic needs of its citizens, even if the quality was poor. What is happening today is even more brutal than the Soviet model, because there isn't even a state that pretends to pay. There is only apparent employment. This resembles the fake cardboard villages that Prince Potemkin built in the 18th century to impress Empress Catherine. The Russian economy has now turned into a huge Potemkin factory. From the outside, the chimneys are smoking, but inside, the machines are rusting and the workers are starving. This is a situation that eats away at the soul of a society. It corrodes people with uncertainty and hopelessness. But that's not the real shock. The real shock is who this crisis is hitting. In the past, crises hit luxury cafes, tourism, and stores selling imported goods. Now the crisis is hitting Putin's most trusted stronghold, the very heart of his war machine. If you're ready, we'll now leave Moscow and head east to the Ural Mountains, to the birthplace of those famous tanks. And what you'll see there is where logic ends. I want to take you from Moscow's gray, uncertain atmosphere much further into Russia's strategic depth, to the Ural Mountains. This is not just a geographical border. This is the insurance of the Russian state. Throughout history, whenever a threat came from the West, be it Napoleon or Hitler, Russia always retreated here, behind these mountains. It moved its industry here, rebuilt its army here. Now picture a massive industrial complex in your mind, so large that it has its own railway network, its own power plants, even its own towns. The smoke from its chimneys darkens the sky. This is Uralvagonzavod. This is no ordinary factory. This is where the famous T-90 tanks you see in the news bulletins, those formidable armored vehicles heading to the front, are born. This is Putin's victory factory, Russia's largest, most strategic, most untouchable stronghold. What would you expect logically? Europe is currently experiencing its largest land war since World War II. The Russian army is losing dozens of tanks and armored vehicles every single day on the Ukrainian front. Metal is melting, tracks are breaking. Generals on the front lines are constantly shouting to Moscow, "Send us more tanks." If you listen to the voice of logic, Uralvagonzavod should be operating at historic capacity right now, shouldn't it? Not 3 shifts, but 5 shifts should be running. The chimney should never go out. The help wanted lines at the gate should stretch for miles. And engineers should be offered salaries on silver platters, because this is a war for survival, right? But no, reality abandoned logic a long time ago. According to shocking reports in the local media that cannot be denied, Uralvagonzavod is currently undergoing massive staff reductions. You heard right, the tank factory is downsizing in the middle of a war. They officially announced that they will lay off 10% of their workforce by February 2026. In some administrative and technical departments, the engineers who design the brains of those tanks, this rate will reach up to 50%. And they have completely stopped hiring new workers. I realize this sounds like madness, In fact, if you read this in a Cold War novel, you'd say the author is exaggerating. It can't be that illogical. Imagine a country that needs tanks, has a factory to produce them, and has workers to do the job. But the factory management comes out and says, I'm out of money, I'm firing my tank building master. This is the exact meaning of that dreadful term that gives this section its title, industrial cannibalism. To understand this event, allow me to take us on a brief journey back in time, to the dusty pages of history, to the year 1941. When the Nazis reached the outskirts of Moscow, what did Stalin do? He dismantled factories in the West and transported them brick by brick to the Ural Mountains, to the very region we are talking about today. At that time, factories such as Uralvagonzavod and others produced in workshops with temperatures of minus 40 degrees, sometimes without even a roof. Women and children turned tank shells. The spirit of the time was everything for the front, everything for victory. There was no economy, only the drive to survive. But today, the situation is very different and much more tragic. Today, what is rotting Russia from within is not an enemy army. What is rotting Russia is the economic trap it has set for itself. Remember, in the first part, I told you about the money magicians, how the central bank raised interest rates sky high. Well, the butterfly effect of that decision, or rather the sledgehammer effect, has now landed on the Ural Mountains. The system is locked up like this. Uralvagonzavod needs steel, chips, and electricity to produce tanks. It needs money to buy these things. But Citibank is gone. Western capital is gone. The Russian state's coffers are running dry. The factory goes to the bank for a loan. The bank says, interest rates are over 20%, I can't give you a loan. Even if I did, you couldn't pay it back. Central Bank Governor Nabiullina has made money so expensive to curb inflation that even the defense industry can no longer access it. This is the story of a snake eating its own tail. There is an ancient symbol, Ouroboros. The snake eating its own tail. It represents an endless cycle. But this cycle in the Russian economy is not one of infinity. It is a cycle of destruction. Putin has exploited the civilian economy for years. He cut education, healthcare, infrastructure. He transferred resources to the military. He killed the civilian economy. But he forgot one thing. The military industry is not an independent structure floating in space. The military industry is a parasite living off the back of the civilian economy. The civilian economy pays taxes, provides logistics, and trains human resources. If you kill the host, the civilian economy, the parasite, the military industry, will eventually starve to death. What is happening at Uralvagonzavod right now is the sound of that parasite dying of starvation. Imagine the helplessness in the manager's office. The phone rings, a general from Moscow is yelling, "Where are my tanks?" The manager replies, "Sir, we couldn't pay the steel supplier. We couldn't pay the engineers' salaries. We have to lay people off." General, "But we're at war." Manager, "But math is also at war, sir, and math never loses." This is not a defeat on the battlefield. This is industrial suicide. A Russia that cannot produce tanks due to lack of funds has lost the war in the factory long before losing it on the front lines. And this situation is not limited to Uralvagonzavod. It spreads like cancer. Because if the tank factory stops, the workshop that sells its screws also stops. The power plant that supplies it with electricity also suffers. The canteen that feeds those workers also goes under. It's a domino effect. Now, I want to ask you, stop for a moment and think. How can one of the world's largest nuclear powers find itself unable to finance its own tank factory? The answer lies in that word trust we mentioned in the first section. If you run the economy like a mafia state, if you destroy the law, if you eliminate transparency, the day will come when you can't find the money to build your own tanks. Those billions that went into the oligarchs' pockets are not coming back as tank tracks. And while industry is experiencing this silent and shameful death, it is not the only disaster befalling Russia. While the economy is devouring itself from within, another blow from outside is preparing to freeze Moscow in the truest sense of the word. Economic collapse is abstract. You describe it with numbers and graphs. The people may not feel it immediately, but physical collapse is concrete. You feel it with smoke, fire, freezing, and deprivation. While Hermann Greff tells Putin inside, "We're out of money," outside, Ukrainian intelligence and brave Russian partisans have launched the most strategic sabotage operation in history. Their goal was simple. What happens to an army without money if we also cut off its fuel? The answer? that army stops, and that capital city is left in the dark. Now we will move on to the physical face of the disaster, to the place of those flames, those burning trains, and those exploding pipelines. Everything we have talked about up to this point, those secret meetings, those billion-dollar bank transfers, that army of ghost unemployed, all of these were, so to speak, a paper disaster. Economics, by its very nature, is abstract. You describe it with graphs, rising red lines, interest rates. A person may not immediately feel the pain when interest rates hit 20%. When inflation rises, they don't feel it on their skin in that moment, in that second. It's a slow, insidious poison. But now I want to take you out of those sterile corridors of the abstract world and plunge you into the heart of concrete, physical, and brutal reality, into a world of mud, rust, fire, and bone-chilling cold. Because economic collapse may be a theory, but physical collapse is a reality. You feel it in the smoke. You feel it in the trembling. You feel it in that click sound when you try to light the stove and it doesn't ignite. While Hermann Greff whispered to Putin behind the Kremlin's thick walls, "We're out of money, the engine is exploding." Outside, in the real world, a much more deadly, much more explosive scenario unfolded. The real story I want to tell you tonight is the story of how physics collapses where money runs out. Ukrainian intelligence, GUR, and brave partisan groups within Russia itself have launched the most strategic, most surgically precise sabotage operation modern warfare has ever seen over the past few weeks. The logic behind this operation was so simple that its simplicity made it terrifying. In the strategy rooms, they asked this question. All right, the money is gone, the banks are gone, so what happens if we cut off the blood in the veins of an army without money? It's fuel. The answer was as clear as an elementary school physics problem. That army stops, and the capital of that empire would be left in the dark. I want to take you back to last week, under Moscow's gray sky. Imagine Moscow on a map, a massive metropolis, and there's a vast pipeline system that keeps this metropolis alive, wrapping around it like a ring, like a wedding band. The Ring Pipeline. This pipeline is the lifeblood of the city. It carries the fuel that heats the homes of civilians, as well as the diesel that powers those tanks. That pipeline, considered untouchable, off limits, was blown up in an extremely well-planned, extremely sophisticated operation. Please don't think of this as just another pipeline explosion news story. The location of the incident, the Mytishki region, is right next to Moscow. It is so close to the Kremlin that the thick, oily smoke rising into the sky after the explosion could even be seen from the windows of Putin's palace. Not only the pipelines, but also strategic fuel depots were targeted. The real issue here is not the cost of the fuel that burned. The real issue is the image that burned. What has Putin been telling his people for years? I will protect you. The world may burn, but Russia is safe. We have the best air defense systems. Moscow is a fortress. But last week, as those plumes of smoke rose into the sky, the Russian people saw this. Ukrainian drones or local saboteurs could waltz right into the Kremlin's backyard and blow up the valves. That black smoke was Putin's security promise going up in flames. For the Russian security bureaucracy, there could be no greater humiliation, no greater shock. So what does a dictator do in such a situation? He immediately switches to Plan B. Putin's logisticians said, "No problem, sir. If the pipelines aren't working, we'll just go back to the 19th century. We'll transport the fuel by train." Makes sense, right? Russia is a railway country, but the minds opposite them, namely Ukrainian intelligence, had seen 3 moves ahead on the chessboard. They knew Putin would use trains. And suddenly the war jumped thousands of kilometers from Moscow, deep into Russia, to the foothills of the Ural Mountains, to the Perm region. I want you to freeze that scene in your mind like a movie frame. The pitch black of night, a desolate, snowy forest. On the tracks, a train miles long, carrying fuel from east to west to the front. Wagons full of flammable material. And suddenly, an explosion shatters the silence of the night. The trains were set on fire while moving. The tracks were sabotaged along with their cargo. This is a logistics nightmare. Do you know what this means? It means cutting off all roads, all arteries to Moscow, to the army, pipes burst, trains burning, alternative routes closed, and now we come to the most ironic, most tragic part of our story. Remember that Citibank exit we mentioned in the first part? That flight of Western companies? Some of my listeners may have thought, so what if the bank leaves? Can't a Russian engineer fix the pipe? Here's the answer. No, they can't. Because the technology needed to repair those burst pipes, those burning pumps, those high-pressure valves is not Russian-made. All that technology came from the West. High-tech valves, sensors, control panels, all of it is under embargo. There are no spare parts. Right now, as we speak, Russian engineers and technicians are trying to keep a massive energy infrastructure afloat by literally taping together low-quality side industry parts from China that don't fit the system. Imagine a patchwork quilt, but this quilt is not made of fabric, it is made of high-pressure oil pipes. And the laws of physics, those laws of physics, they don't listen to propaganda, they don't listen to Putin's speeches, those pipes won't hold. The system is collapsing. And do you know who's at the door? Russia's greatest ally throughout history, the one who defeated Napoleon, who stopped Hitler, the famous General Winter. But this time, General Winter is not on Russia's side. This time, he is against Russia. Hermann Greff's warning, Citibank's exit, the 254,000-strong army of ghost unemployed, burning trains, it's all coming together. And the reflection of this logistical chaos on the streets is giving birth to the greatest irony of the 21st century. This is the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas. Oil flows like a river from underground, but above ground, people are queuing at gas stations. There is production, but no distribution. There is oil, but no valve to put it in the tank. Now, can you see the big picture? That economic collapse discussed at that table in the Kremlin in the first scene is no longer a piece of paper. It is no longer a statistic. It's now an empty gas pump. It's now a cold radiator. But that's not what really terrifies me, what keeps me awake at night. If you want to see the collapse of a society, you shouldn't look at gas stations, you should look at kitchens. Before I finish, I have to share with you a very human, very painful, and heartbreaking piece of data. This data is much more important than tanks, dollars, or pipelines, because this data is directly related to survival. Recent reports published by the Ukraine Strategic Communications Center and independent statistical agencies, based on Russia's own data, show how a nation is shrinking biologically. I'll put it simply, the Russian people are now eating less. Please don't mistake this for a metaphor. Milk and dairy consumption in Russia has fallen by 8%. Purchases of rice, the people's most basic food, the cheapest means of filling their stomachs, the friend of the poor, have fallen by 10%. Let's pause and think about this. Why would a society drink less milk? Why would a mother, when she goes to the supermarket, put that packet of cheese back on the shelf? Because she doesn't love her child? Because of the healthy living trend? Because she's on a diet? No. Because she can't afford it. Because that ghost unemployed father's salary hasn't been paid. Because inflation is no longer hitting luxury consumption, but the bone development of those people, the growth of their children. And this is not just an economic crisis. This is biological regression. Putin's famous unwritten social contract with his people ended right there, in those empty milk bottles, on those supermarket shelves. The agreement that lasted for years was this. The people said, I won't get involved in politics, I won't speak up, I will obey you. But in return, you will feed me, you will keep me safe. Putin said, I will give you an empire, I will give you pride, I will give you Crimea. But at the end of the day, that agreement broke down. Today, the Russian people have neither an empire to be proud of nor a loaf of bread to take home. The empire is mired in Ukrainian mud. The bread is crushed under the weight of exploding inflation. And hope? Central Bank Chair Nabiullina, that magician woman, recently came out and admitted in an icy tone, interest rates will not go down. The belt-tightening policy will last for years. Don't expect any relief until 2026. So this winter, this cold they are experiencing, it's just a preview. It's the first chill of a long, dark, and hungry period. Let's end our story where we began, back in that room. Hermann Greff's cry at that table, the warning that the engine is breaking down. It echoed off those thick walls and died away. Putin didn't want to hear it, and now that truth he didn't want to hear is descending like a nightmare upon all of Russia. When you turn on the TV, if you have a TV in Moscow, television in Moscow, you can still hear the victory marches. The announcers can still smile and say, Europe is freezing, we are great. But history, sociology, and economics have taught us one lesson, one immutable rule. In authoritarian regimes, the greatest battle is not fought on the front lines, but within the home. In the war between the refrigerator and the television, the refrigerator always wins, without exception. The television can tell you you're poisoned. It can say, we won. But when you open the refrigerator door, when that cold light hits your face and you see those empty shelves, the truth is there in all its nakedness. And today, Russia's refrigerator is emptier than ever in its history. And that emptiness screams louder every day. I want to leave you with this question. No matter how powerful a regime may appear with its tanks, missiles, and police force, if it has taken away its citizens' milk, bread, and hope for the future, hasn't that engine already stopped? We just haven't heard the noise yet, or maybe we don't want to hear it. Thank you for joining me. This is not just Russia's story. It is the story of reality's inevitable victory over propaganda. Until next time.